I didn't hear the bell, but I assume it's time to start. John has the slides up. That's a good indication. Did you notice our greeters this morning? Layla, Lily, and Laura. Just to see those three smiling faces is enough to make anyone want to come in. So you thank them when you see them between Bible class and worship or at the close of services. We are in Esther today, chapter 2, and our procedure for Esther is to read the chapter, and then in the remaining time we'll go through as much of the second chapter as time permits. Next Sunday morning, Kurt will be teaching Esther chapter 3, so you'll read ahead and prepare for that class, God willing. Tonight, John Orr will be with us at 5 o'clock, and he's going to be telling us about Home Mission, which is a program that started just a few years ago that he's heading up now. They come into congregations that are struggling and work with them and try to build up the church in the community. And he just wanted to come and tell us a little bit about that particular work. He's not raising funds, so in case you're wondering, that's not the purpose. It's informative, and he'll be preaching as well. So I hope you'll plan your day so that you can be here for that also. Randy and Suzanne are back with us, and they're going to take Abby and her friend out to lunch after services this morning. I told Abby when she walked in, I hope she got a free lunch out of this visit. She said that's why she's here. So I want to make sure that that happens. Awesome. Now, Esther chapter 2. Would you open your Bibles and follow along as we read the text? After these things, when the anger of King Ahasuerus had abated, he remembered Vashtai and what she had done and what had been decreed against her. Then the king's young men who attended him said, "Let beautiful young virgins be sought out for the king, and let the king appoint officers in all the provinces of the kingdom to gather all the beautiful young virgins to the harem in Susa, the citadel, under custody of Haggai, the king's eunuch, who is in charge of the women. Let their cosmetics be given them." Rhonda Feisley would not like that. She would prefer to sell them, but let their cosmetics be given to them, and let the young woman who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti. This pleased the king, and he did so. Now there was a Jew in Susa, the citadel, whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, son of Kish, a Benjamite, who had been carried away from Jerusalem among the captives, carried away when Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, had carried away. He was bringing up Hadassah, that is Esther, the daughter of his uncle, for she had neither father nor mother. The young woman had a beautiful figure and was lovely to look at. And when her father and her mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. So when the king's order and his edict were proclaimed, and when many young women were gathered in Susa, the citadel, in custody of Haggai, Esther also was taken into the king's palace and put in custody of Haggai, who had charge of the women. And the young woman pleased him and won his favor. And he quickly provided her with her cosmetics and her portion of food, and with 7 chosen young women from the king's palace, and advanced her and her young women to the best place in the harem. Esther had not made known her people or kindred, for Mordecai had commanded her not to make it known. And every day Mordecai walked in front of the court of the harem to learn how Esther was and what was happening to her. Now when the turn came for each young woman to go into King Ahasuerus, after being 12 months under the regulations for the women, since this was the regular period of their beautifying, 6 months with oil of myrrh and 6 months with spices and ointments for women. No wonder, fellows, it takes a woman a long time to get ready on Sunday morning. 6 months and 6 months a year for Esther and her friends. I guess we're pretty fortunate. It only takes an hour for our ladies. But I digress. When the young woman went into the king in this way, she was given whatever she desired to take with her from the harem to the king's palace. In the evening she would go in, and in the morning she would return to the second harem in custody of Ashgar, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the concubines. She would not go in to the king again unless the king delighted in her and she was summoned by name. When the turn came for Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her as his own daughter, to go into the king, she asked for nothing except what Hegai, the king's eunuch, who had charge of the women, advised. Now Esther was winning favor in the eyes of all who saw her. And when Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus into his royal palace in the 10th month, which is the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign, the king loved Esther more than all the women, and she won grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Then the king gave a great feast for all his officials and servants. It was Esther's feast. He also granted remission of taxes to the provinces and gave gifts with royal generosity. Now, when the virgins were gathered together the second time, Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate. Esther had not made known her kindred or her people, as Mordecai had commanded her, for Esther obeyed Mordecai just as when she was brought up by him. In those days, as Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bigthan and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs who guarded the threshold, became angry and sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. And this came to the knowledge of Mordecai, and he told it to Queen Esther, and Esther told the king in the name of Mordecai. When the affair was investigated and found to be so, the men were both hanged on the gallows, and it was recorded in the book of the Chronicles in the presence of the king. And that's chapter 2. I know it's long. It takes a little while to read it, but how can it ever be wrong to read God's Word together? All right. We learned in chapter 1 that Vashti had been summoned by King Ahasuerus, or if you're Greek, Xerxes, but she refused. As a result, the advisors of the king said to him, "This cannot stand. If the queen can reject the command of the king, every woman in the land, all 127 provinces, will have no respect for her husband. Something has to be done." And so Queen Vashti must go, and a successor must be sought. Now, let's go forward 5 years. And what we discover is that the process of selecting a successor to Vashti is now underway. And you say, well, how do I know that it's 5 years? Because I read the text. And I know when the events in chapter 1 occurred, and I know when the events in chapter 2 occur, and there is about a 5-year time difference. I also know historically, just for the record, that in the interim it seems that King Ahasuerus had made an attempt to invade Greece. He was at first successful, but ultimately was defeated and returned back home and spent the rest of his life essentially occupied by his harem. And so this 4-year military endeavor seems to have come to a close, and now he's reminded that he needs to select a new queen, and the process begins to unfold. And Esther becomes prominent in this account as the one who will ultimately, providentially, I think, succeed Vashti as the king's queen. Now, let me tell you immediately that when you read Esther, that it is not a book about acceptable morality. And there are many things about this story that, from a Christian perspective especially, we will find somewhat objectionable, or at least I would hope we would find somewhat objectionable. But the purpose of the story is not to teach moral principles. The purpose of the story is to illustrate, I think, first, the courage of a woman who seeks to preserve her family, not just her immediate family, but the entire Jewish nation. And secondly, and probably more importantly, the providence of God that makes it possible. And I may have mentioned either last week or at some other point in discussing Esther that there are two stories in the Old Testament that really encapsulate the providence of God at work, and interestingly, neither of them requires the miraculous to achieve the proper outcome. The first is Joseph, and the second, in my judgment, would be Esther. And this is how God is able to deliver his people, the children of Abraham, from the brink of disaster, annihilation, if you please, through the courage of a little Jewish young lady who captures the attention of the king and is able, as a result, to work through a process that will enable her own people to be spared. So, this is not a passage of Scripture that encourages in any way young women to enter beauty contests. Some would say this is what is occurring in chapter 2, and I guess I really don't have any trouble with labeling it that way. But that's not the purpose of the story, to suggest that this is how proper young ladies should behave. The purpose of the story, and please do not lose sight of this, is to show how God delivered his people from the brink of disaster. All right, having said that, let's look at the text as much as we can this morning, and that just means if I talk less and focus on the text more, we'll get through more, and if not, we won't. After these things, the events of chapter 1, the story that I just shared with you of the king's adventure militarily and its failure, the anger of the king is abated. He's been away from home, from Susa, the palace or citadel, now for a number of years. He's returned, and it's pointed out to him that he doesn't really have a queen. He remembers Vashtai. He may even remember that he could have perhaps acted a little more hastily than he should. I don't know the precise relationship that the king had with the queen, but I do know he was enamored by her. It was his beauty that he wanted all of his guests to behold. And please understand, as I told you last week, was I here last week, Kurt, or the week before? Last week, contrary to the popular belief, it seems that he was not asking her to parade before his guest in a state of disrobement, but simply saying, I have a beautiful wife, I'd like to introduce her to you. And the real problem is her refusal to obey the king. Not that she's a terribly modest person and the king has made some terrible demand that she, because of her modesty, is unwilling to acknowledge. If that be the case, that really puts Esther in an unfavorable light, in my judgment. And I don't think that's fair, given the setting, the culture, the customs of the day. What seems so unusual to us was fairly common at this time. So he remembers Vashtai and what she'd done and what he had decreed, and therefore knows that he needs to take action. The young men who attended him said, this is what we should do. We should just gather all the beautiful maidens throughout the land. There are 127 provinces. We reach from Ethiopia into India. And from this vast territory, we will find the most beautiful women, virgins, and bring them to the citadel, prepare them for the king, and from them he can choose who will be his next queen. Most commentators would say that these women were forced into this situation, and that may be possible. I suspect far more likely there was simply an acknowledgement that the most beautiful women in the land are sought, one to be the queen. I have no doubt that there would be many who'd gladly volunteer. It would be a small price to pay for the benefits that they would receive, because life would go from being very hard to being relatively easy. And I don't think that people are much different than they were 2,500 years ago as compared to today. And I look at the idiots that get on television and some of these TV shows, and I think if they would volunteer for that, I have no doubt at all that 2,600 years ago, 2,500 years ago, ladies would line up. Am I pretty enough? Will I get selected? Is there any possibility I might be queen? So I don't know if any of them are forced into it. I don't know if they're all volunteers. I'm sure if they all volunteered, somebody had to make some careful separation between those who were really beautiful and those who thought they were beautiful, but that's for another time and another story. I just know that they're opening up the floodgates for beautiful women to possibly become queen. And among that number, as we learned in our reading, was to be Esther, the Jewish girl. But they're to let the beautiful young women be sought out for the king. And there will be a process, and people will be appointed to see that this process is followed. And all of these beautiful young virgins will be gathered in Susa at the citadel or the palace. And ultimately, the king will be given opportunity to make his selection. So that's essentially the first element in the story as that unfolds. And there's reference here to Haggai, who has really charge of the harem, and he's the king's eunuch. He's no threat to the king's harem. And of course, you may recall that when David was ousted by Absalom from Jerusalem, one of the first things that Absalom did was put a tent up where it would be visible for all, and gather David's concubines and had relations with them because that defiled them. Well, that just shouldn't be done. They are the king's property, and if you have the king's property, you have the throne as well, and that's what Absalom was seeking to accomplish. The harem was sacred in a sense, and so they put people in charge who are no threat to the king's harem, and this man Haggai was top dog, so to speak, and he's no threat if you know what a eunuch is, and I'm assuming you're all adults and do, so I won't go into that any further. Let the young woman who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashtai, and the king thought, that's a great idea. Let's do it. So he did so. There was a Jew in Susa, the citadel, also called Shushan, whose name was Mordecai, and he was the son of Jair, son of Shimei, the son of Kish, a Benjamite. So we trace his lineage back to the tribe of Benjamin, but this Kish is certainly not the father of Saul, the first king of Israel. Saul, the son of Kish, who was a head and shoulders taller than anyone else in the land, was selected as the first king of Israel. He was of the tribe of Benjamin as well, but I wouldn't make any further connection than that. He'd been carried away from Jerusalem among the captives, carried away when Jehoiakim, the king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar had carried away in 597 BC. And it's not Mordecai here that had been carried away. I think we're talking about Mordecai's ancestry. And he's now in Susa, the citadel, because his family in 597, in that second incursion of the three that the Babylonians launched against Jerusalem, was brought into Babylon and ultimately ended up in Susa. If we were talking about Mordecai being removed in 597, he would be an old man at this point in the story, and there's nothing to indicate that he's an old man. An old is older than me, if you're wondering what old is. Some scholars would say that if this was really talking about Mordecai and not his family being moved to Babylon, he would be well over 100 at this time. And there's nothing in the story that would imply that to be the case. So Jeconiah was king in 597 and was exiled to Babylon. He was bringing up Hadassah, that is Esther. Now, somebody gave me one of those crossword books that you can get that's biblically oriented, and I don't do crosswords, so I brought it to Diane, but there was one on the book of Esther. And one of the first, I don't know if they're hints or definitions or requirements, was the relationship of Mordecai to Esther, and the answer was uncle. I said, no, it's not. The whole puzzle was messed up because the man who did it, and he's the man who did the puzzles for the New York Times at the time, didn't know his history. Mordecai was not Esther's uncle. You ask just about anybody their relationship, and they will tell you that uncle, niece. But that's not the case at all. You figure out what relationship they were as we go on. He was the daughter, or she was the daughter of Mordecai's uncle. And she had neither father nor mother. Remember in our study of Hebrews what was said about Melchizedek? No beginning, no end, no father, no mother. That's just the typical way of expressing someone who's lost their parents. And in the case of Melchizedek, we have no information about his ancestry beyond the fact that he lived in the brief encounter with Abraham and the single comment in Psalm 110. But it just simply says, basically, her parents are dead. And all she has is cousin Mordecai, first cousin Mordecai. The young woman, this is Esther, had a beautiful figure and was lovely to look at. On a scale of 1 to 10, she was clearly a 10. And when her father and her mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. Obviously, he's older by some years than Esther. And so when he brings her into his home, she is not his cousin. She becomes his daughter in terms of their relationship. In terms of blood, they're still cousins. But in regard to the relationship, it's like father-daughter. And that's very normal. This is how God intended things to be done, by the way. I think that sometimes it would do us all good to be reminded of what Paul told Timothy about the church's responsibility to widows, and how they must be widows indeed and of a certain age. And furthermore, that if there's family, family has responsibility to care for the aged first and foremost. Even those outside the church understood that, and if you as a Christian are unwilling to embrace that idea, you're worse than an infidel. And I say that because I have sadly see more and more people who seem to think that caring for the elderly is just about everybody's responsibility but theirs. And that's not the way God intended, not the way it ought to be in the church, and I just throw that out there because this reminds me. Mordecai had a cousin who had no one else. Well, the only right thing to do is just open his home, embrace her as he would embrace his own daughter, and raise her as such, and clearly he did. So when the king's order and his edict were complained, all these young women are gathered in Susa. This would take some time. Remember, it's a huge empire. And so it'll take a little time to get all of these women together. You've got to select them and then bring them. And after that, there's a year of preparation. Don't feel too sorry for King Xerxes, however. He still already has a big harem. And it just absolutely is beyond my comprehension how things so quickly devolved so much in the wrong direction from the beginning in Genesis 2 where God brought Eve to Adam, and Adam said, "Bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh, she shall be called woman, for she's taken out of man. For this cause a man shall leave his father and mother, cleave to his wife. They two shall be one flesh. What God has joined together, let not man put asunder." And the clear emphasis, and Jesus re-emphasized that in Matthew 19, is God's plan, one man, one woman for life. But by the time you get to chapter 5, you encounter Laban, who decides that one's not enough, and he has both Ada and Zillah. And then by the time you get to King David, there are 8 wives, and I don't know how many concubines. And then you get to Solomon, and there are 700 wives and 300 concubines. That's how far Israel strayed from the law that God gave them. So it's not shocking or surprising that a pagan king would endorse a process like this and have the kind of harem that he clearly had. And Esther is destined to be a part of that process and ultimately the queen. So she's taken into the king's palace and put in custody of Haggai. I don't know how this process unfolded. I can't tell you that she was simply seen and taken out of the grasp of Mordecai. There's nothing in it that would imply that that occurred. She may have simply been told by her cousin / dad, "You're a beautiful woman, go for it." I don't know. And when I don't know, I just tell you I don't know, and we move on. And so all of these women, including Esther, are brought. They're all virgins, and they're put under the control of Haggai. Quickly, she won the favor of the chief man, the head eunuch. And so he treated her in a special way. She got the best food and the best apartment in the whole harem. And she apparently, from what we're able to tell, had no problem with eating the king's food. Now, we just completed a study of Daniel not all that long ago, and when Daniel and his friends are brought into the fold, so to speak, under Nebuchadnezzar, Babylonian king, and they're going to be trained for approximately 3 years, the first thing they did is say, "We're not eating the king's food and drinking the king's wine." And most would believe that it's because they would be compelled to eat things that were unlawful according to their law, and they were going to abide by the customs of the Jews and the kosher diet. And yet here, Esther has none of those reservations. That's why I want you to remember, this is not a story designed to teach us moral lessons. It's really a story to show us how God intervened providentially through this woman to save the sons and daughters of Abraham. Every day, Mordecai walked in front of the court of the harem. He is concerned about his cousin / daughter, and so he goes there to see what tidbits of information he can pick up. Take a child to college. You don't just leave them and abandon them, typically, especially that first year. You stay in contact, you call, you text, you email, you FaceTime, you visit. No different with Mordecai. He didn't have all those technological advances we have, but he's still vitally concerned, and so every day he's there to see what's going on with Esther. Now, when the turn came for each woman to go before King Ahasuerus or King Xerxes, this is the process that is outlined, a preparation. And there are 6 months with oil of myrrh and 6 months with spices and ointments for the women. This is their beautification, the text here calls it. And when the young woman went into the king in this way, she was given whatever she desired to take with her from the harem to the king's palace. So we've got all of these young ladies, and each one will have her time with the king. And when that night comes, she is permitted to take anything she desires with her in her effort to please the king and ultimately to become queen. To put it frankly, he would sleep with her. And then he would decide, discard her, or is she the one? And if he didn't think she was the one, off she went to the second harem, and the next gal in line will come. And again, I just find this absolutely preposterous, but it's not a moral lesson. Why do I keep saying that? Because there are people who read this and think that there are all kinds of moral principles established that are not established. There is no way on God's green earth that we can honestly, from a biblical perspective, say, this is a wonderful process. Maybe it ought to be done more. Now, you know as well as I do, that's not in any way acceptable. But it's what happened, and you have to applaud the complete abject honesty of the record. In the evening, she would go in, and in the morning, she would return to the second harem in the custody of Shaashgaz. I love that name, don't you? He's the king's eunuch who's in charge of the concubines. Now, these girls who have been gathered are in the harem, but they're not yet any of them queen, and none of them yet are concubines. But after their night with the king, if they're not chosen, they just simply become part of his concubines. And if that happens, she'll not visit the king again unless he personally calls for her by name. So they are essentially exiled to a life of widowhood if they are rejected by the king. But they are living in a palace where all their needs are met. They're required, as far as I can tell historically, to do no manual labor. They're just basically to stay in shape and look good in case the king might desire one of them. And I can understand how 2,500 years ago or so, that might be an appealing position for someone without real morals and principles. And these, by and large, with the exception of Esther, are pagans, and they have no real morals. That's one of the reasons why you find when God sent Israel against the Canaanites, he said, destroy them. They were, well, I can't say godless because they were idolaters, but they worshiped gods that did not exist, and they did all kinds of things that are immoral and repugnant to a normal culture in the name of religion. Most of the ancient religions involve fertility cults, and there's not a whole lot of a redeeming value in any of them. And so that's the background out of which all of these women really came, with the exception of Esther. So I'm not surprised that they had no difficulty apparently in selecting these young ladies and getting them prepared for their night with the king. When Esther's turn comes, and again she's the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her as his own daughter. This is significant because we need to keep in focus the relationship between Mordecai and Esther. When it comes her turn, she doesn't ask for anything except what Hegai, head of this group of women, these young virgins, recommends to her. Who will know the king better, do you think, than Hegai? And Esther has caught his eye. He elevates her above all the others. He wants her to succeed. And so he gives her the kind of advice that gives her really an upper hand, an advantage, if you please. And she hits her turn with the king. And she apparently has no problem with this. If she does, there's nothing in the text to indicate it. Correct? Go like this. So she's agreed to the whole process. She's willing to take her turn, and as they say today, let the chips fall where they may. When Esther was taken to the king into his royal palace in the 10th month, which is the month Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. See, you go back and read chapter 1 and find out when Vashtai was deposed and see how many years have passed since that event, bringing us to the 7th year of his reign. And she goes to him and wins his favor so that he set the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. So the contest is over. Esther has won. She's now wearing the crown. The king then gave a great feast. He also granted remission of taxes. Now that's one aspect I wouldn't mind still following from time to time. Instead, today they get elected and they raise your taxes. Wouldn't it be wonderful if somebody came in and said, no taxes? We're going to stop wasting money for a year. Then the king gave a great feast for all his officials and servants. It was Esther's feast. He also granted remission of taxes to the provinces and gave gifts with royal generosity. So he now has a queen, and they celebrate. Is this an example of an ancient reception after the wedding kind of thing? Seems to me to be a fair analogy, although I suspect this one a little more elaborate and a lot more costly. Now when the virgins were gathered together the second time, Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate. Esther had not made known her kindred or her people. Nobody knows but Esther and Mordecai that she's a Jewish young lady. She had been specifically told by her uncle, don't tell anybody. Now, what does that imply, even at this juncture in history? When I say anti-Semitism, what do you think of? Specifically, a bad attitude toward the children of Abraham. We're called Jews. And it seems that there might have been, from the advice that Mordecai gives Esther, a little tinge of that in the Persian Empire. The Jews have been persecuted throughout their history. Now, I need to pause and tell you that, quite honestly, much of it they've brought on themselves. And that's no defense for mistreating them. And just as surely as I would tell you that we should not be racist, we should not hold ill will or harbor hatred in our hearts toward Jews. They start out in Egyptian bondage, basically, and find themselves ultimately in Assyrian captivity, in Babylonian captivity. Here they are scattered throughout Persia, even though the return, at least the first return, has occurred, and Zerubbabel has led in 536 returnees back to Jerusalem, and they began to rebuild the temple. They still find themselves constantly oppressed. In the New Testament, Palestine's an occupied land, and the Jews were oppressed. But I said to you, they often brought it on themselves, and I don't mean to speak disparagingly, but when you make the argument that you're better than everybody else, you're opening yourself up for all kinds of hurt. They did not seem to understand what people today still do not understand. Abraham's children were called not for privilege, but for a purpose. And all they could see was the privilege, and they lost sight of the purpose, and it brought them a lot of grief and heartache throughout their entire history, even right up to this day, in my judgment. And I label it as that. If you tell everyone you are a son of God because Abraham was your father and therefore you are the redeemed and it's all about blood ties, you just open the door for a lot of problems. And that's what they did. And if you don't believe me, read John 8. We're Abraham's children. Never have we been in bondage. Huh? That's one of the most audacious lies in the New Testament. Jesus said, you're not Abraham's children. If you were Abraham's children, you'd listen to me. Your father is the devil. But they didn't get it. They thought it was all about blood. And so they're better than everybody else. It's true, God had chosen Abraham and his descendants, and through his seed all nations of the world would be blessed. But again, and I know I harp on this continually, but seed is singular in this context, not plural. All nations of the world would be blessed not by the Jewish people, but by a single Jewish man. We call him Jesus. And if you have doubts about that, read Galatians chapter 3. So Esther has not made known her identity at this time because Mordecai had told her not to. This seems a little out of place, but it's so important to the story. As chapter 2 closes, Mordecai has overheard something sitting at the gate of the king's palace. Some say that he was perhaps a high official within the Persian government already. I don't know if that's true or not. Clearly, he's somebody of influence, and certainly more influence now that his first cousin / daughter is the queen, but he's sitting at the king's gate when Bigthan and Teresh, two of the king's trusted servants, have a plot to assassinate the king. And he informs Esther, Hadassah, and she in turn informs the king. It's investigated, discovered to be true, and guess what? Bigthan and Teresh swing from the rafters. Now, you probably are not aware of the fact that the king ultimately loses his life because of another plot, and he's actually slain in his own bedchamber, not part of the historical narrative of Esther, but in fact what happened. And you see something similar to this in the book of Isaiah in regard to an Assyrian king slain by his own sons, who then had to flee. Being a king was not everything it was cracked up to be. Yeah, there were some perks, but there was always somebody out for your job and willing to do whatever it takes to get it. And these two, for some reason, were out to get the king, but Mordecai discovers it, reports it to Vashti. Vashti tells the king takes care of the matter, and it's recorded in the book of Chronicles. There is an historical record. Don't forget that, because we're going to come back to this story and what Mordecai actually did before we finish our study. And this plays a very integral part in the whole process. That means next week, Kurt will pick up our study in chapter 3. I know you didn't think it would happen, but it did. And I'm sure he'll be able to get through chapter 3. As it's outlined, we have just enough Sundays to take one chapter per Sunday and conclude on time, Michael. I'm not promising you that will happen, but we're going to try. Next Sunday, I'll be with the church in Belington, West Virginia, God willing, for a gospel meeting. That's located between Philippi and Elkins. For those of you who wondered, Bill Wharton called me early last week to find out where in the world Belington was and why I wasn't in Brookville, Pennsylvania, because he'd gotten them reversed. But that's where I will be, the good Lord willing. You'll be here. And Kurt will have, I'm sure, a really interesting lesson from chapter 3. And Harry will be speaking at our morning and evening assemblies. So that's something to look forward to. Good to see you all. Enjoy your next 15 minutes as you visit. And don't forget to thank the girls for being greeters today.